Right, thank you very much. Good morning and welcome everyone to the Justice Committee's 4th meeting of 2015. I can ask everyone to switch off mobile phones and other electronic devices as they interfere with broadcasting, even when they're switched to silent. No apologies have been received. Item 1. I'm inviting the committee to consider item 3 on the draft report on our supplementary LCM, and then item 4 on our work programme in private. Are you agreed? Thank you very much. Item 2. This is our final day of evidence taking at stage 1 of the Prisoners' Control of Release Scotland Bill. I welcome to the meeting our first panel of witnesses, Michael Masterton, Cabinet Secretary for Justice, along with the Scottish Government officials, Philip Lamott, Head of Criminal Justice and Sentencing Unit, Jane Muffet, Head of Rehabilitation and Reintegration Unit, and Anne Davis, Director for Legal Services. I understand, Cabinet Secretary, you do not need to make an opening statement. So far you've won friends. So I'll go straight to questions. I'll take Christian, then Elaine, then Gil, Alison, Margaret, Roddy, John. Why not join in? Yes, Jane, there we are. You're all down for questions. I've forgotten who I'm starting with. Elaine. No, I'm not. It was Christian, is it? You've not written it fast enough. Christian, you're too fast for him. Right, off you go.
Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. You heard during the evidence, we had a lot of concern regarding cold release. I think every witnesses and every submission we had a very great concern about cold release. We heard from the Scottish Association for the Care and Resettlement of Offenders, SACRO, to answer the question how to try to ensure that release of prisoners are safely reintegrated back into communities. They said not to remove automatic early release entirely, but reduce it to the last 3 months of the sentence to ensure that there was some brief period of compulsory supervision to oversee reintroduction to the community. I think that's important. When I asked the question to Peter Johnson, for example, talking about a mandatory, I called it a pre-release supervision, there were some scope and some of the people who came and give evidence thought it could be an idea to amend the bill. Any thought about this?
I think I'm conscious that some of the evidence that you have received has raised concerns about the issue that you described as being cold release and the implications of that. I think it's worth, though, taking a step back and just considering some of the issues that are at play at the present moment. Although the bill intends to end automatic early release, there is still the provision, obviously, for parole-conditioned release to take place. And if someone receives release on conditions set down by the parole board, then they have a level of supervision, and that's the case at the present moment. That will be the case with the ending of automatic early release. It just means at the present time, when you can apply for parole halfway, if you're refused, when you get to 2/3, doesn't matter, you get automatic early release. That element will end with no supervision in place. So there are the individuals who will be released with conditions set by the parole board. So that will happen. There are also a significant number of prisoners who receive extended sentences which are handed down at the time in court. So that's for those individuals who have a determinate sentence, and once they've served that period and they're released, there is a period of supervision which then takes place after that as well. And it's clear there is a category of individuals who may not qualify for parole, for any form of early release, and then may be released at the end of their sentence. And I'm open to exploring with the committee, given the evidence that you've heard, whether there are measures that could be put in place in order to try and address the concerns that have been raised. So, for example, SACRO's suggestion around the idea of 3 months, so that 3 months prior to the person due to be released, if they were to be then given a period of supervision in order to help move them back into the community and to address any issues that there may be. I'm open to considering that, and I would welcome the committee's input and views on that particular approach. So there's I think it's worth keeping in mind, though, it's not that all prisoners will be in that situation, because you will have those who will get parole release and who will be supervised, and also those who will have extended sentences imposed at the time of their sentence. But for that smaller category of individuals, I'm more than willing to explore whether there are further measures that we could take to improve the bill.
No, I think, for example, Peter Johnson was very, very clear that he thought that for all prisoners who were under extended, post-release, we'll have no problem at all with that. We're only talking about the very small number, as the Cabinet Secretary, as you said, and I think it's a very small number. But if we could reassure most of the people who came and give evidence for this small number of prisoners who could end up being released in cold release before any mandatory release supervision, I think that would help greatly.
Well, I'm prepared to look at that. You know, if there's for example, and I take from Sacro's suggestion, the idea would be is that they would receive parole release 3 or 6 months prior to the end of their sentence in order to supervise their move back into the community. If that's a way which is more appropriate to try and manage some of these risks, then I'm open to exploring how we can improve the bill in this particular area. And if other members of the committee have got other suggestions, I'm again content to consider these in going forward with the bill.
Thank you for it.
I don't know, Cabinet Secretary, if you had the opportunity to see the written submission from Professor McNeill of the 20th of January to the committee.
No, I haven't.
In which he says, and I'll quote, "I spent last week in a meeting with European experts from several jurisdictions, and many of them were expressing concern about the increasing numbers of prisoners opting to, in quotes, max out, close quotes, on their sentences in order to avoid the painful uncertainties attendant on discretionary release schemes and the more and more intrusive and sometimes disproportionate forms of post-release supervision emerging in many jurisdictions." In other words, saying, I'm not looking for early release, I'm not looking for parole. It means I can just, when I get out, I'm free and easy. I'm not done that. Have you addressed that? I don't know if you addressed that in your answer to Christian.
Well, you have that at the present moment with automatic early release. They just have to serve 2/3 of their sentence and they can be released, even though they may have been considered in previous years by the Parole Board as being a risk that they don't believe they should be released into the community. What I'm more than prepared to look at is whether there are, for those who get to the end of their sentence, whether there is measures we could take to try and help to address some of the concerns that the committee have had highlighted to them. But I should also emphasise there are provisions which are open to the courts at the present moment in order to apply an extended sentence for individuals when they've been sentenced that they think will continue to pose a risk, to apply that. And maybe if I can give you a couple of statistics, it might demonstrate the scale to which extended sentences are used. So in 2013-14, 42% of sex offenders getting a sentence of 4 years or more received an extended sentence. 50% of sex offenders getting a sentence of 10 years or more received an extended sentence by the courts, and 32% of non-sexual offenders receiving a sentence of 10 years or more received an extended sentence. So courts at the present time, in considering a case, have the flexibility and option available to them to extend an individual sentence at the time of their period in custody, if they believe that they will continue to pose a risk. So the issue is maybe more around whether some members feel as though that's been used sufficiently by the courts, and whether there's any measures that can be undertaken in order to look at extending that further.
I'll let other members then perhaps return to other issues. Elaine, followed by Gill, followed by Alison.
Yeah, thank you, Convener. We heard a number of pieces of evidence. Professor McNeill, in written evidence, said that the question of how best to manage early release should be referred to the Scottish Sentencing Council. Professor Tata agreed with that, saying that he couldn't support the bill as it is, and the Sentencing Council should be looking at these sorts of issues. Peter Johnson, the Risk Management Authority, also thought that further thought should be given to the bill rather than proceeding with it as it stands. Lisa Mackenzie of the Howard League said the Scottish Sentencing Council is recruiting staff and it seems a shame to be preempting its existence. I wonder what's happening with the Scottish Sentencing Council, and would they not be better placed to examine these sorts of issues?
Well, I think, first of all, I'm open to improving the bill, but I'm also committed to ending automatic early release, as we've set out very clearly within the bill. Now, clearly it's for the Scottish Sentencing Council to determine what their work programme is. Of course, we could ask them to look at further issues around automatic early release at some point in the future, and the Scottish Sentencing Council is due to be up and running by the end of this year, which is a piece of work that's been taken forward by the Lord Justice Clerk, who will head up the Scottish Sentencing Council. So, you know, from the quotes you've made reference to, you know, I'm, as I've said to the committee, open to look at how we can improve it, but I'm also clear in our commitment that we are going to end automatic early release. If the committee and others have a view on how we can improve the existing bill, then I'm more than content to consider these issues. But equally, in ending automatic early release for the way in which we have set out in this particular bill, if there are further areas that should be considered at a later stage, then that is a matter which the Scottish Sentencing Council could consider. But I don't think we have to wait to make a decision on ending automatic early release for the Scottish Sentencing Council to come to a decision in the matter.
But it's true, though, that it's only ending automatic early release for about 1% of the prison population. And I wonder if you could maybe explain what the thinking is, because there was an alternative approach postulated through the Custodial Weapons and Sentencing Act in 2007. Now, the McLeish Commission found a number of problems with that, in particular as it would, you know, the prison service really couldn't cope with the increased number of people who would be kept inside at that point. And then your government amended that through the 2010 Criminal Justice and Licensing Act, which enabled ministers to bring in a phased implementation of basically a sentencing regime where there would be a defined period in prison and a period under supervision in the community. And I just wondered why, instead of progressing with that approach, which I think your own government agreed with, this other rather contradictory approach has come in, which will only affect 1% of the population.
Well, it's 1% of the population based on the timescales that we've set within the bill itself. So the 10 years for non-sexual crimes and 4 years for sexual offences. If the committee have a view as to whether that threshold should be lower, then again I'm prepared to consider that. I know there are some stakeholders who would say that they would believe that the threshold should be lower for both categories, which in doing so would then have a bigger impact on the percentage of the prison population that would have an impact on. With regards to the wider issue around the other possible route that could be taken, you still have the issue about addressing automatic early release. The issue was about providing transparency in sentencing policy. So you have the period in custody and a period in the community. What we are doing with ending automatic early release is that an individual will then be required to have their case considered by the parole board, and the parole board will determine whether they believe that they should be released early. At the present moment, we don't have that at all. Once a prisoner gets to 2/3 of their sentence. The other thing is it's worth keeping in mind around the other approach to changing the sentencing arrangements was that, as Henry McLeish also pointed out, there are a number of other issues that would have to be addressed before that could be introduced and taken forward. A large part would be about addressing short-term sentences in order to create capacity within the prison estate, in order to keep prisoners in prison for longer periods of time. So there's a number of other things you need to do before that would be possible. Some of which we're already doing, but I also think it's important that we send out a clear signal about ending automatic early release.
But surely the issue for victims and for the community is that a sentence should mean what it says. You know, and the approach in the 2007 and 2010 Acts also actually was about a sentence being what it, you know, somebody would serve the sentence they were given rather than come out early, which I think is actually the objection that the public have to automatic early release, is that you think somebody's going away for 6 years and they only go away for 3 years. And the other approach would tackle that perception issue without potentially releasing people out at the end of a sentence with no support at all. And I think that's one of the concerns about this, is, as Christian said, is that, you know, people could end up at the end of their sentence with no support whatsoever. They will have served what they were supposed to serve, but there's nothing there to support them into the transition back into the community again.
Well, for a small proportion of prisoners, that would be the case, and it may be there are other ways in which that can be addressed, but the certainty that a victim has in ending automatic early release is the knowledge that that individual will not be released automatically when they get to 2/3 of their sentence, irrespective as to the risk that they may continue to pose. So it gives us a way in which we can address that much more effectively, and it's clearer for victims in that sense. But as I say, I need to reinforce the point is that it would only be for a small proportion of prisoners who may get to the end of their sentence that could be released that would have no supervision. And that's why I think I'm more than happy to explore ways in which we can address those concerns.
And do you think you will bring in the provision to the 2010 Act in terms of the orders that you could make? Because that was going to be a more staged approach to bringing in the sort of...
Well, as Henry McLeish pointed out, there's a range of other things you have to do around dealing with short-term sentencing in order to address that shift as well. And we're committed to doing that. We've already got to the point where we have moved for a presumption against 2/3 sentence of less than 3 months. And if the committee's got a view of moving that further, then I'd be more than happy to explore that with the committee around tackling the effectiveness of short sentences. And that was one of the key things that were highlighted at that particular point by Henry McLeish in his report.
Yeah. So, I mean, is this the first stage then? Do you intend to end automatic early release? I mean, because this doesn't end automatic early release, not in the vast majority of cases, it doesn't. So are you intending to move further as...
I'm prepared to consider whether there are, for those stakeholders who do believe that the thresholds come down to, I'm more than prepared to explore that. I'm not in a position where I'm saying, yeah, I'm going to bring it down to X level at the present moment, but I'm, at the 4 and 10 year thresholds that we have set is a position that we have started with as a government, and I'm prepared to look at extending that further once I've been able to consider these issues further. So, and if the committee's got a view, I'm more than happy to explore that with the committee.
Thank you. Gill, followed by Alison.
Thanks very much. Good morning, panel.
Good morning.
I want you to take you, Cabinet Secretary, to post-release rehabilitation and programmes that are in place. I was involved with the Save Peterhead campaign and travelled up there and met lots of people that were involved in the programmes there. It drew world attention, the success rate in Peterhead, and I believe that continues to this day. And of course, prisoners that are more than 4 years who volunteer to participate in these programmes, whether they were doing it because they felt that their behaviour needed to address. This is sexual serious offenders, or if they were, lining up to benefit from the parole board's appreciation of doing something positive. But the outcome, no matter what the category, those who were doing it for the right reasons and those who were doing it to get out early, the same conclusion was that both categories got a lot of benefit from it. There was no difference, apparently, from the two different categories. But one of the things that came up in the first session in this inquiry, or this evidence-taking session, was that the prospect, simply because if we do away with early release, then as night follows day, there's going to be more people that would possibly benefit from rehabilitation programmes within the prison setting. But the question that arose was that two things that came in evidence was, first of all, presently resources are being a bit squeezed, that folk that were already there and volunteering, some people weren't benefiting from it. And secondly, since there's going to be higher numbers, then resources might be further squeezed. So my question is, can you assure the committee that since there will be longer, if it goes ahead, then there will be more people spending longer terms in prison, but the opportunity to engage in the programmes that are very, very positive are there, but will the resources be there to make sure that that happens?
And I would imagine in reference to the Peterhead campaign, that was a stop programme which Peterhead was one of the pioneers in taking forward to rehabilitate sex offenders, which I know that in the evidence you received from the Chief Executive of the Scottish Prison Service, Colin McConnell, he was expecting an increase in the number of prisoners who would take up rehabilitation programmes, largely on the basis that if you know you're going to be automatically released at 2/3, then there's less of an incentive for you to participate in a programme. If you wish to secure parole early release, then you are going to have to demonstrate that you're addressing your offending behaviour and that you're making progress on that. So there's obviously an incentive there for prisoners then to take up these programmes. In terms of how resources are deployed to meet that increasing demand, that would be a matter for the Scottish Prison Service and to manage that within their resources. There will always be pressure on these things. It's like every other department in government, there are financial pressures which make things challenging, which is why it's important the programmes which the Scottish Prison Service are running are ones that have better outcomes, that they are the ones that make the difference, and to be focused in providing them. So, I would like to give you an assurance that the Scottish Prison Service will do their best within the resources that they've actually got. And I would, I think one of the benefits is that in more prisoners undertaking rehabilitation is it helps to reduce the potential for them to commit further offences in the future as well, which would have a medium to long-term benefit in terms of reducing demand on the system. So there's an element where you're investing in these types of rehabilitation things to reduce further demand at a later stage, which would be the preferred approach I would like to see happening.
Yeah, one of the things in the Peterhead campaign to save Peterhead, eventually it was saved, of course, was lots of women's groups who were looking after people who had experienced some of the impact of serious sexual attacks on women and children, that they were to the vanguard to save Peterhead because of these very programmes. So I'm really want to know if you're comfortable in that we can assure the committee and women's groups in particular that we can handle this in the expected numbers. There will be greater numbers, and we can actually help and increase the number of people who are in prison to change their behaviour. We did receive evidence, not from the prison service. I listened carefully to what they had to say. It was reassuring, but I got the feeling that they will do the job as best they can, as you explained. But I'm really concerned that we do use the opportunity in this early release, or the end of early release, that we tackle those who perhaps are not putting themselves forward, who would definitely benefit, and it might actually be a resource issue. And I would be grateful if you would maybe perhaps look at that to reassure yourself, reassure me in particular, and this committee.
Of course, I'm more than happy to look at that, and I'll certainly discuss that particular point with the Chief Executive of the Scottish Prison Service. What I would say is that, particularly when it comes to sexual offenders, there are a whole range of other measures when a sex offender is released from prison as well, in terms of supervision, etc., that's put in place in order to address areas of risk, notwithstanding any rehabilitation they may have undergone well in prison or not undergone well in prison as well. I think also part of the challenge is to make sure that that we increase the number of those prisoners who are participating in these programmes. And I believe that by ending automatic early release and the requirements that the Pro Board will have in order to consider whether someone should be released early, will act as a driver for more prisoners to participate in these programmes. So I do think one of the benefits that will come from this is the increasing number of prisoners who will participate in the programmes. But I'm more than happy to discuss with the Chief Exec of the Scottish Prison Service that about how they are going to address any additional demand. I'm confident they'll be able to do so, but if the member would wish me to do that, I'm more than happy to do that with them.
Grateful for that. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Gil, followed by Alison, then Margaret, please.
I'll just pursue that a little bit further, if you don't mind, Cabinet Secretary. You've said that you hope that the ending of automatic early release will act as a driver. The views that we've heard have been mixed, I think, on that, to be fair to say. But what has been quite clear, I think, is that we heard from Professor Miller that equity in provision and access to programmes across Scotland will become more important. And there will be perhaps a human rights issue underneath there if prisoners are not able to access release through parole because they have not had access to the proper programmes due to pressure or due to them not being available in one particular area, that the consequences might be, and I quote Professor Miller, the consequences for prisoners' rights, if they're not given the rehabilitation programmes, that they will be looking for more than that in the past. And committee needs to look at that as a foreseeable consequence as we go forward, and perhaps the Minister could reflect on that as well.
Yeah, I'm more than happy to do that. I think it's also worth keeping in mind is that ending automatic release doesn't just increase demand tomorrow. The time frame for this to kick in is over a 10 to 11 year period, by the way, in which with the turnover of prisoners. So there's a period of time which allows for planning and to develop programmes that can meet that increase in demand. But I'm very clear in my view around tackling Scotland's prison population, and a big part of the focus has got to be is tackling underlying causes of offending behaviour. I also recognise that prisons are not also the best place to rehabilitate people as well. But while you do have individuals in prison, you have to make the best opportunity you can in order to try and achieve that. So it's an important element of one of the three pillars of our prison system is having adequate rehabilitation provision available to it. But I'm more than happy to make sure that we continue to explore how we provide equity of provision of rehabilitation services within our prison estate to ensure that we can be confident that we are maximising the potential we can get from rehabilitation while individuals are in prison, notwithstanding the financial constraints that we're in just now at the present time, which allows us to give us, and as I mentioned, 11 years, gives us some time for some of the planning and some of the additional work that will be necessary. But I'm confident the professionalism of our prison officers and the Scottish Prison Service will be able to provide the additional support and assistance that will be required in rehabilitation.
Thank you.
Thank you, Alison. Margaret, followed by Roderick, followed by John, followed by Jean.
If I could just pursue that particular issue a little further, Cabinet Secretary, this isn't a new problem. For many years now, in excess of 10 years now, we've looked at inadequate provision of rehabilitation programmes for prisoners, and it does boil down to resource. If I can quote Dr. Monica Barry, she highlighted it's not a demand problem with programmes in prison, there is a supply problem. So it doesn't matter how professional the SPS is, how many discussions are there, unless the resources are in place, we're going to have the same kind of situation as we were finding in the report from HMS Shotts, which found there is still lack of meaningful and productive work available for prisoners. And that isn't a good state of affairs for anyone. Yeah,
you will be aware of the updated report on Shotts, which has actually said there's been a significant level of improvement made in providing purposeful activity as well. So they have addressed a number of the concerns that were highlighted in the previous inspection report. And I think it's important to recognise the work that the professional staff within Shotts are undertaking and in addressing some of the deficiencies that were highlighted as well. That was published a few months ago. The report, the updated report. So there was an update that was published. So around some of the progress that's been made on some of the challenges that had been identified in Shotts. as well, and I think I made reference to that, I think just before Christmas in a parliamentary question that was asked to me as well on this issue by, if I recall correctly, Alex Ferguson, when he raised the matter in the chamber. Can I say that, you know, there will, I think part of the challenge within the prison estate is to make sure that we are using the resources in the way that can best affect change. So one of the challenges around that is to make sure that we are, so for example, there are those who oppose the idea that we should have a presumption against short-term sentences. Short-term sentences have been demonstrated as being a very ineffective way in dealing with offending behaviour. Even sentences of less than 6 months are a very ineffective way of being able to address offending behaviour. But they take up a tremendous amount of the Scottish Prison Service's resources. So if there's a desire to make sure that we are much more effective in rehabilitating prisoners within the financial environment in which we operate, I think we also have to be realistic about how we can achieve that and how we can make sure that we're providing that greater provision of rehabilitation that some people may believe is necessary, to do it in an equitable fashion, but to do it in a way that actually has better outcomes for those prisoners that they are targeted at in order to deal with their offending behaviour. But part of that also means being honest and realistic in looking at some of the aspects around short sentences, which we know are extremely ineffective in addressing offending behaviour. But they cost the taxpayer a very large amount of money and a large amount of the SPS's budget, which potentially could be better used for rehabilitating those more serious offenders who pose a greater risk to our communities. So I'm more than happy to have that debate and to explore these issues. But I'm very much of the view that it has to be a balanced approach about how we can make better use of rehabilitation within our prison establishments.
On the issue of short-term sentences, I mean, for various reasons, people will end up there when they've gone through all the other disposals. When there's a breach, the only disposal left is a short-term sentence very often. And I would have thought, therefore, it was more important that rehabilitation programmes would be available for these people in that circumstance. For example, identifying literacy and numeracy problems, which we know a large population percentage of the prison population do have. Are there plans to look at automatic testing of that and to provide even a gatepost to where more support can be found for those people with, say, dyslexia, for example? All of these things help rehabilitate people who have offended for various reasons. And we know that that can lead to, these difficulties can lead to criminal behaviour. But it's a resource problem now in prison that could be used to stop recidivism rather than the revolving door where they're coming back with, I would argue, a greater cost to the community.
Well, I'm all in favour of stopping the revolving door. And I think everybody in the committee would be signed up to that. It's about taking an approach which is effective in stopping the door from revolving. And what I think we need to do is we need to be very clear about how we are going to go about achieving that. And a big part of that, as you're correct, is about addressing the causes of offending behaviour. And from my perspective, and you know, the evidence shows this, is that given the situation that very often prisoners present themselves, particularly if they are serving a sentence of maybe 3 or 4 months, that they will also have automatic early release at 2/3 of their sentence. It gives the Scottish Prison Service an absolutely tiny window to try and address these things. And I think it's unrealistic to expect the Scottish Prison Service to be able to deal with, if they've got literacy issues, all of these issues in what could be a very, very small timescale while that individual's in prison. So I think part of the challenge that I believe we need to debate is about, well, is that an effective use of a resource? Would a...
Sorry to interrupt you, both of you, just a minute.
Is wanting us to move on.
Yes, well, it's a very interesting debate, but we're opening it up now to the revolving door, short sentences and so on, which is important. but we're actually examining the bill in front of us, which is not short-term.
Bill.
So if you can
Yeah.
go back to... Thank you. I mean, it is a big and interesting debate, but we are digressing.
Could I ask your opinion, Cabinet Secretary, of Professor Tata's comment, rather than making sentencing clearer, the bill actually muddies the water in that a 10-year sentence is 10 years. Somebody else on 9 years, for example, is released after 2/3. That's 6 years. Isn't it really just complicating the sentencing process rather than making it easier to understand and more effective?
No, I don't agree with that position. I'm aware of the view and the evidence that was given to the committee. I believe that by providing an end to automatic early release, we put ourselves in a situation where victims will have the certainty that individual will just not automatically be released at 2/3 of their sentence, irrespective of circumstances.
Would that be the case if it was automatic early release abolished for everyone, as opposed to the small group that has been targeted?
That's a different scenario then. But that's a different scenario if you're saying the threshold should be lower and that we should be taking a larger number of prisoners into the category of not qualifying for automatic early release. So if that's the view that Professor Tata or yourself have on this matter, as I said, I'm prepared to look at the thresholds. What that threshold should come down to is something that I'm more than prepared to explore. But I do think in ending automatic early release, it gives a clearer indication that someone won't just be released just for the sake of it because they happen to have got it 2/3 of their sentence.
Right, I'll sense you want to move on.
No, it's just... Yes, it's just that I'm looking at the purpose of the bill, which, of course, is key, and it says certain long-term prisoners. So it has to be, as I understand it, 4 years and over, whatever happens. So if you want to get into this debate, it maybe have to be other legislation. I don't know if this could be amended, even if one set one's path in that direction.
If you were to go below 4 years?
Yes, I don't think it could.
We are restricted to the long title of the bill,
yes,
in terms of what the provision would be.
That's right. So it would be a different place. Anyway, I'm moving on to Roderick, John and Jane.
Morning, Cabinet Secretary.
Morning.
Notwithstanding the policy memorandum and the acceptance in the policy memorandum that reoffending rates for sex offenders serving sentences more than 4 years were not necessarily higher, we heard concerns, particularly from Mr Johnson, about the selection of sex offenders and the logic for that because of kind of generally low rates of recidivism. Would you like to comment on that particular point further?
I think, well, as a parliament, and this government and previous governments have taken an approach where we have dealt with issues around sex offenders in a different way, largely because of the impact that sexual offences have on both the victims and the families and their wider community. And that's why we have a range of provisions in place which to safeguard the community from sex offenders. So we believe that it's an appropriate measure to have a lower threshold for sex offenders given that. And that's why we have a different threshold from that we've set for serious offenders of 10 years for non-sexual crimes.
Okay. Mr Johnson said that sex offenders generally tend to cooperate in prison in terms of accessing programmes, so that in his view, these were the people who should not be focused on. And anything else to add to that point?
Well, the numbers of them will participate in different programmes, but I do think it's important as well that we also have a threshold for sex offenders that allows them for, if they are going to apply for early release, that we have appropriate supervision put in place, which a parole release would help to provide. So I think what I also think will happen is that, and as some of the evidence you've received to the committee suggests, is that an increasing number of sex offenders will also participate in rehabilitation programmes. I think in your evidence from Colin McConnell, he felt that It's around the current uptake for sex offenders amongst programmes that are offered is around 50%. He thinks that and estimates that that will move up to around 67% in ending automatic early release. So that will assist us in increasing a number of sex offenders who are participating in programmes to address their offending behaviour, which can assist us in helping to reduce the risk of them once they return back to the community.
Okay. Could I just move back briefly to the question of cold release, which we started with? Mr McConnell, in his evidence, said that his experience was that the first 6 to 12 weeks after release can be extremely risky. And his emphasis, he said, is on making custody itself less distinct and less disconnected from the community. And that includes moving resources, prison officers, much more into the community to work alongside citizens who are moving from a period of custody back into the community. Any comments on those comments from Mr McConnell?
I think this goes back to some of the issues that were raised by Mr Allard, and that was around the issue about other measures that we should take that could assist in helping to put provisions in place that means that when someone's coming to the end of their sentence that there's a period of supervision if they haven't qualified for parole release. I think it's also worth keeping in mind, though, is that there's a significant amount of work being undertaken at the present moment by the Scottish Prison Service in order to better manage through care of prisoners, particularly for them going back into the community. With a named officer, within their establishment, links with social work, with housing. You'll be aware of the programme that my predecessor set up, which is the cross-portfolio programme, looking at the whole area of housing, health, other areas that can help to support individuals in moving back into the community as well. That work has to start early in prison in order to make sure that when someone is being released is that it's been properly planned for and it's able to be implemented at a time when an individual is being released from prison. So there's much more now happening in terms of managing through care of prisoners and planning for their liberation. And alongside that, I think you know, the issue that Mr Allard has raised around considering whether there are measures that we could put in place within this bill to address the issue of folk ending their sentence without any supervision could assist us in trying to address some of the concerns that have been raised.
So, in essence, this emphasis on through care in any event, irrespective of the detail of these provisions, that continues anyway.
Of course,
yeah.
Yes.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you. John, followed by Jane. John,
Thank you,
please.
Convener. Good morning, Cabinet
Good morning.
Secretary. Cabinet Secretary, Professor McNeill, in his evidence, which you'll have seen, extols the committee to lift the quality of public debate. And can I commend your comments about the ineffectiveness of short sentences, your comments about prevention and about rehabilitation. He also talks early in his evidence about the use of language and the use of unconditional in terms of early release. And he goes on to say that it's not a helpful statement because individuals remain liable to return to custody to serve the remainder of their sentence if they commit a further imprisonable offence. There's a suggestion there's a lot of populist background to legislation like this, particularly the references to sex offenders, when, as Mr Campbell, I was going to go, I'll not repeat Mr Campbell's questions, but the level of cooperation we have from them. Can I ask you about MAPA, the multi-agency public protection arrangements? Because, can I first ask you what the purpose of the bill is? Is it to enhance public safety?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, if it's to enhance public safety, Minister, would you not be better setting this aside, this legislation aside just now, and concentrating on Section 10 of the Management of Offenders Scotland Act 2005, 10-year-old legislation, because the provisions of MAPA don't cover violent offenders. And that seems to me, and in another walk of life I have some personal knowledge of this, to be a far more pressing matter than dealing with the matters that we're dealing with here.
Well, MAPA is a framework which is for the purpose of sex offenders and those with mental health conditions that brings the agencies together in terms of planning. The person obviously requires a level of supervision. Supervision provision has got to be in place, so it can't apply in circumstances where that's not the case. we're presently undertaking a piece of work internally in government, which is the MAPA principles that are used for sex offenders being used for violent offenders. And that piece of work is due to be completed this year to see how we can extend that principle and that framework and approach to dealing with violent offenders as well. So I think there are a lot of values within the MAPA approach and a lot of principles that potentially can be used for non-sexual violent offenders. And that's the work that we're taking forward just now. And I would expect to be in a place by the end of this year to look at how we could extend that provision to violent offenders of non-sexual crimes.
That's helpful, and I'm sure the committee would be grateful if you keep us updated on progress with that, because it aligns with some of our other work as well. But if the priority is the protection of the public, to what extent would putting in place MAPA for violent offenders offset any of the aspects of this legislation? Because clearly, many people would imagine legislation that had been in place since 2005 should have been enacted by now.
Well, you're in a situation where you've an individual, when you get to 2/3 of their sentence, that if there's no extended sentence provision put in place and they don't qualify for parole, is that they're being released without any necessary supervision provisions put in place. Without any supervision provision being put in place. The bit from the issue around is whether, from what I'm taking from your question, is whether MAPA should be used as an alternative dealing with that supervision. Is that correct?
Well, in the scheme of things, we have legislation in place which has not been enacted in relation to a purpose that this legislation asserts to be addressing. And I'm wondering if we're out of kilter with things. For instance, I mean, it is the case that someone can serve a full 10-year sentence for violent offence, not cooperate with the prison authorities throughout, and be let out the gate, full stop.
And that's part of the reason why we're taking forward the work to look at using the MAPA principles for violent offenders, which we're doing just now.
I'm questioning the priority or the urgency.
Well, we'll be in a position this year to look at taking that forward once that piece of work is being completed. The impact of this bill is over a 10 to 11-year period. So the timelines are, I don't think there's a conflict between the timelines. I would expect the work we're undertaking around the MAPA principles for violent offenders is something which we could have well in place before the provisions of this bill actually start to have a significant impact on our prison population.
But it is the case where they're already in place and they should have been in place, then many of the issues that have been raised about cold release and that would have been addressed, because you'd have been able to say, well, MAPA.
Well, MAPA, keep in mind, is there needs to be a supervision provision in place for the individual. So if the person gets to the end of their sentence and there is no extended sentence in place, then MAPA doesn't apply.
There could be a very violent person who's been released into the community.
Which goes back to the point that Mr Allard was raising, and that is I'm more than happy to explore with the committee the idea of individuals getting to the end of their sentence and if they have no supervision provisions in place for going back into the community, a way in which we could use the bill in order to achieve that. But we are talking about a very small number of individuals, because courts at the present time, if sentencing someone they think is violent and could be a risk at the end of their sentence, they have the option of being able to provide an extended sentence after they've served their period in custody.
I think the public, though, Cabinet Secretary, might reasonably expecting us to encourage you to put in place the full provisions of legislation that's been on the statute book for 10 years, rather than putting in new legislation, which in turn might have aspects that are not imposed for 10 years. So that's why I'm keen to encourage you to follow up on that.
Well, I hope you're reassured by the work that we're doing just now.
I do understand the work's ongoing, yes.
Which we'll have by the end of this year,
yes,
around MAPA. So I hope that would provide you with reassurance in taking that forward.
It does indeed. Thank you.
Can I just ask Cabinet Secretary, this business, this looking at MAPA and how it operates, when is that going to come to any kind of crystallisation? Is it the end of the year?
So that work started at the end of 2013 and they've been taking it forward over the course of last year, and it's due to be with ministers by the end of this year.
Yes, I think that the expectation is during the course of this year, recommendations to ministers, and then obviously following any decision, it would come before the
I
Parliament.
think, I'm just going to say to the committee, I think quite useful if we kept our eye on this and perhaps had a session ourselves at some point, because there are issues just now with the way MAPA currently operates. I don't want to digress, having rebuked somebody else for digressing, but it's my understanding that prisoners released currently back in the first instance to where they were resident, and that may be where the crime was committed, which means you get vigilantes, you get all kinds of things happening. You know, there are issues about the way it operates just now, so I would hope that if we're looking at that, the committee would have the opportunity also to examine that. It's a matter for us, really, as it's an important, but it has flaws as it operates at the moment.
And I'm more than happy to keep the committee informed of progress on this matter, and once we start to get to the point when details come to us, more than happy
thank you very much. Thank you, because I think we've all had some examples within our constituencies of it not operating the way one would wish it. Jane, you've been very patient, but I know it's worth waiting for.
Thank you, Convener. Morning, Cabinet Secretary. John Finney stole my question. I was going to ask about MAPA. I've got some experience in a past life of how it works, so quite interested in the scope for MAPA to deliver a bit more of its objectives, but that's been dealt with. So I'm going to ask about another aspect of the bill, which is the early release for community rehabilitation. We had some witnesses who've said that that was a slightly tokenistic approach. Other witnesses who said it was a very practical response to the help and support that the prisoners needed at the time of the release. I'd like to hear your view of how much value you think a couple of days is going to make at the end of a sentence, and how many prisoners do you think that will affect?
This came about as a result of the work that's been taken forward in the ministerial group around tackling reoffending. And one of the issues, if I can give you a practical example, because I was a health minister who sat in that group, and I now chair that group in this portfolio, one of the challenges that was highlighted was an individual who was in Barlinnie prison, was liberated on a Friday, but they resided in Oban. And by the time they got to Oban, in order to see housing and other services on the Friday, they were in a situation where very often the offices had closed, and that they were able to get access to a GP, these types of practical provisions, all of which go back to the point around through care and improving through care and managing prisoners back into the community. Because we know that if we don't manage that effectively, you are in danger of just continuing with the revolving door that Margaret Mitchell made reference to for some of these individuals. So they end up homeless. They think the only way in order to get themselves back in somewhere, they end up committing offences and back into prison again. So that managing that period is extremely important in itself, and it requires a multi-agency response, health, housing, etc. So as a practical response to that, it was to give the Scottish Prison Service the flexibility to be able to flex that by 2 days. So, for example, going back to my individual in Barlinnie, who may reside in Oban, it may be for practical reasons in order to manage their move back into the community that we should do that on the Wednesday, so that we can get the housing, we can get the benefit issue, we can get the health issues sorted out before the weekend, so that we're not setting someone up to fail. And it's a small practical thing which I think can make a significant difference in those types of instances, and it's to be used at the SPS's discretion. It's not something that will be used routinely, but it allows them a level of flexibility so that they can accommodate that type of issue as and when it arises.
Just another brief question, Convener. Thank you. Thanks, Cabinet Secretary. I'm interested in how local authorities and other public sector agencies work together to support prisoners on release. It's part of this rehabilitation programme as well. And I'm wondering if you think that community planning mechanisms have got, if there's any scope to develop through community safety approaches, a stronger network, a stronger partnership working between housing and health and all those agencies you spoke about, so that they're better prepared as a team to cope with prisoners who are being released into their communities.
I definitely think there is a role for community planning partnerships there, and As you'll be aware, there's a commitment in the programme for government to take forward changes to community justice partnerships, and part of that will be looking at this issue around how we can affect better planning in these areas. But maybe just to give you a further example, we have a piece of work we're taking place in Perth at prison, which is working with housing agencies there. If there's an issue that's flagged up to me by those who work with offenders, it's housing tends to be this key issue that if it's not managed, it just breaks down so quickly. So part of that is to look at how we can, they've got a pilot in how they're working with some of the housing partners for their offenders and using different approaches to make sure they manage that much more effectively and plan it much more effectively. We've also got a piece of research that we're undertaking across the country, which is looking at other approaches that are being used in different parts of the country to try and manage the issue of housing when prisoners are released as well. So I think it's not just a matter for the community planning partnerships, it's also a matter for our local authority housing departments, our housing associations, all to recognise that they've got a part to play in working with the SPS to try and deliver this. The SPS can only do so much, and they need to see themselves as being partners in that. And for example, some of the work that we've commissioned is off the back of the Eilish Angelini report, for example, the Tomorrow's Women Glasgow project. That's a project where there is a housing official in the team, and their job is that when individuals are moving back into the community, to create that link. And when I was chatting to this particular official, it was very clear that her mindset had changed since she'd come into that role from being a housing official, because she views it entirely differently. And she now finds herself going to her colleagues and saying, no, you're going to have to think about this, and challenging their normal way of working as well. So more of that type of approach is the type of thing I want to see happening. But I think it's important that we don't just expect the SPS to sort it. The other stakeholders have all got a part to play in helping to address these types of issues.
Thank you. And just briefly to say, I think the revolving door starts to burrow at the custody stage sometimes, that there's a need to provide these sorts of supports right through the prison system, right pre-court, pre-trial. Whenever people are in the system, they need to start to get that kind of support. But that's a different bill, a different meeting, convener. Thank you.
I just like the word burrow. It's a great Scottish word. It's visual, isn't it? Burrow. On that note, and burrowing, can I say that? No, I'm not looking at them because there's no hands up. That's the end of our question session. Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary and your officials. And we're now moving, as we've agreed previously, into private session. So I'll ask the room to be cleared, please.